everyone, and thank you for tuning in to this edition of Reporter's Notebook. Today, I am joined by fellow digital reporter and co-host of our podcast, Ms. Emily Severich. Hello.
Hello.
How are you?
Doing good today. It's raining outside, so, a little bummed out, but...
You know what? If I had, like, a cup of coffee right now, I feel like this would be the mood to kind of just, like...
Yeah. Got my iced coffee. I should have gotten hot. But...
Yeah, I'm kind of jealous because it's running pretty late and I still got a lot of work to do. So, so I asked you to be on this podcast because we are doing this podcast called What the Politics. We are on episode 17, 18. We're up there with our podcast episodes. So let's talk about the two guests we had on for today. So. Who did we have on for today?
Yeah, so our first guest that we had on today, and that episode is going to be airing tonight, so check it out. We had William Barney join us. He is a professor at UNC Chapel Hill, and so he's a history teacher, so he really kind of helped us break down the historical context of what we saw happen at our United States Capitol last week. So that was a really interesting conversation, kind of a breaking down and understanding, how these situations have happened in the past, how this kind of built up to this point, and how we can move forward from that as well. So be sure to tune into that because it's a very timely podcast and definitely something that I think our nation really needs to hear right now. So,
and I think it was important to have him because, or Emily, I hope you agree with me on this point, is sometimes when we see events as I'm going to say the word traumatic as what we saw on January 6th is that we kind of need to step back and put things into context. And I think having a historian join us is something that could at least put in perspective what just happened on January 6th compared to the rest of American history and hope and put in that hope in our democracy because this is not the first time that we've been through something as traumatic and as divisive as what happened on January 6th, and having him talk to us, having someone who has that knowledge of what happened in the past and even what contributed to it,
right?
I think was really, really awesome and really important to, at least for me, as a young person, to hear.
Yeah, and as young journalists, I think it was important to hear as well that, he was really making the point that it's important not to look at events like this as a singular event, that we have to really realize, the steps and the implications that led up to that event and how it could have been prevented, how, similar situations have occurred and why, and how we need to look back on those and realize that, making the same mistakes repeatedly, you're just going in a circle. You're not making any progress with that. So
right, yeah, and one of the sayings, I don't know if I'm gonna get this correct, but it's like something about history repeating itself. If you don't learn history, you're doomed to repeat it. And I think that's something that we need to remember moving forward and what we can learn out of what happened on January 6th and try to look at it from an objective lens. So that was one of the reasons why we were super excited to have him join us. And then our second guest that we had today, which that podcast will air next week, but I was super excited to have this guest. So Emily, who was our second guest for today?
Yeah, so we got to talk with another professor. This one was from ECU. Her name is Dr. Andrea Kita. And she specializes in conspiracy theories and folklore. So she helped us really talk about conspiracy theories and how they gain traction here in our country, how social media feeds into that, and really kind of figuring out, how can we determine fact from fiction when it comes to not only political conspiracy theories, but conspiracy theories in general, and how we really need to be researching that on our own, drawing our own conclusions about what's really makes sense here.
Right. And I don't want to give out too much away about what we talked about in our podcast, but I think one of my favorite points that we talked about is this idea of American heroes and the idea that American individuality, excuse me if that's, I just slurred over that word, but the American individual has this kind of, I can do anything, I am a hero, I am here to save the day narrative. And I know that probably doesn't make sense right now in the context of what we're talking about, but how that can kind of feed into conspiracy theories in the sense that what happened on January 6th could be viewed as, if we were trying to view it in the lens of someone who participated, as someone who was trying to protect the ideals of American democracy. And following what happened on January 6th, some of the ideas that were circulating on a few platforms, and how those circulations feed into each other and feed conspiracy theories. And another point that she made is that sometimes things just don't make sense. So we try to make sense out of them, and that's not necessarily a good or a bad thing. That's human processing.
Right.
I don't know if you had any thoughts about that, Emily.
Yeah, I definitely thought that was an interesting point, that it's really, and you kind of almost, she was explaining it, you almost need to be kind, I guess is the right word I can think of, to people or these conspiracy theories, because it's really, again, a person, a human, trying to break down that process in their own mind and figure out what makes sense to them given their own life context and what they've experienced and what they know to be true, and then trying to figure out if that theory makes sense by putting those together. And it's really a human process, so you really can't, look at someone and say, like, oh, you're dumb for believing that, or that doesn't make sense, or blah, blah, blah. You really have to just let that person kind of go through that process on their own of figuring that out.
Right. And then I think another important point is just like when it comes to misinformation, it's just kind of trying to do your own research, check the sources, and that can also be something that can help combat any sort of conspiracy theories, or at least make sense of the events of what happened, besides, going towards a conspiracy theory.
Right. Because there are definitely, and she says this, there are, fake outlets and news outlets and fake websites and things like that are simply created to deter people or to make people believe a certain thing that may not be true. So it really is important to, not only for conspiracy theories, but just for politics and American government in general, or just for anything, to make sure you're really taking the time to look into where something came from, where that source come from, is it being talked about on other reliable sources, and really figuring that out for yourself is super important.
And kind of wrapping up this edition of Reporter's Notebook, I do want to say that one of the points, and I don't know if you agree with me, Emily, yet, but this is at least one of the points that I try to make when we do our podcast, is we try to look at the events of what happened, try to analyze the topics that are there for the day, but we also try to look forward. We try to explore solutions. We try to have some sort of outcome that an individual can practice. I don't know if you feel the same way, Emily. From our conversations, yeah. I think we're both kind of trying to provide that message with each of our podcasts about it's not just hear the topic and full stop.
It's not end all game all kind of thing. It's really, we want this to be a working conversation. These topics are not going to go away. These situations don't go away. This is a continuous process and continuous thing. So, constantly having that open dialogue and being able to talk about it continuously is super important. And that's, one of the reasons I know me and Victoria really wanted to start this podcast, was to create that open conversation with, not only ourselves for our own personal interests, but with you guys, the viewers, and also with our special guests that we have as well. So that's super important to us, and we really do encourage you guys to please reach out to us. Email us, reach out to us on our social media if you have ideas or topics you want to hear, or if you have questions that you want answered by us or experts that you're curious about. Please, reach out to us. We want to keep this as open as possible for you guys.
Right, exactly. And thank you so much, Emily, for joining me on this edition of Reporter's Notebook. Again, you can listen to What the Politics. It's on our website under one of the tabs. Under the features tab, you'll see features, WNCT Podcast Network. There's What the Politics, but then there's also the Sports Talk one. So you have two podcasts that you can check out. But of course, we know you're going there to check out What the Politics. We're excited to announce a few of the guests that we have coming up. So stay tuned, because that's something that we've both been working hard on. And again, thank you so much for joining us on this evening's edition of Reporter's Notebook. Be sure to tune in to What the Politics on Apple and Spotify, and of course also on our website at WNCT.com. All right, everyone, good night.